The Cuyahoga County Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, October 10th, 2017, first session of the 2018 to 19 budget hearings will please come to order, and the clerk will call the roll.
Calling the roll, Ms. Brown. Here. Mr. Hairston. Mr. Hairston is absent at the moment. Ms. Simon. Here. Ms. Baker. Here. Mr. Miller.
Here.
Mr. Tuma.
Here.
Mr. Gallagher.
Here.
Mr. Schron. Mr. Schron is absent. Ms. Conwell.
Here.
Mr. Jones.
Here.
And Council President Brady. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Has anybody signed in for public comment related to the agenda?
No, no one has signed.
Okay. We will now move on to item number 4, which is the overview of the 2018 to 19 biennial operating budget. Welcome to the County Council budget hearings. Our tasks are to work with Executive Budish and his administration to create a balanced budget, ensure that the highest priority services are provided, ensure that community progress continues, and keep Cuyahoga County on a financially sustainable path. I express my thanks to Council President Brady for giving me the opportunity to lead these hearings and for his leadership in working with the executive during the time leading up to the budget hearings. We face serious challenges. The loss of $25 million per year in Medicaid sales tax revenue, combined with the importance of dealing with the opiate crisis, early childhood education, infant mortality, lead-based paint, and workforce development, to name a few, create short and long-term challenges for both the general fund and the HHS levy. I do believe that the other side of crisis is opportunity, and that our solutions must be at the system-wide and community-wide levels. Executive Budish will start with a 15 to 20-minute overview of the budget proposal, followed by a more detailed presentation from Director Kennedy and/or Budget Director Keenan. Please limit any questions to Executive Budish to those of a broad or strategic nature. Detailed questions should be directed to the finance leaders. And with that, I now call on Executive Budish to present the budget overview.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mr. President, Vice President, Mr. Chairman, and all council members. It's great to be before you today. It is budget time again. And today I am proud to say that I'm presenting to you a balanced budget for the years 2018 and 2019. I'm very conscious of the fact that all of the outstanding progress that I'm about to outline would not have been possible without the vision and support of all of you, our council members. This is where I butter you up a little bit so that you'll pass this budget. Together, we have accomplished a lot. And my goal for this budget is to continue this great momentum and progress that we've been building. This budget continues to invest in job creation, attracting, creating, and growing business. It increases our investments in small businesses, female-owned businesses, and minority-owned businesses. It continues to invest in job training programs, making sure that we're creating a path out of poverty, enabling people to get the education and training that they need to fill the thousands of jobs that are currently open and the jobs of tomorrow. It continues to remove barriers that our residents face in obtaining good jobs that put them on a career path, including expanding the training opportunities in our jail for reentry. This budget increases our investments in the infrastructure of the county, particularly roads and bridges. The state legislature has determined to allow counties to add a $5 license fee to support road and bridge projects, and we've submitted to council separate legislation to implement that. Look, the reality is that our cities need help, a lot of help, maintaining and improving their infrastructure. And the options for obtaining funds are severely limited. This budget makes available more money than ever before for these critical infrastructure projects. And we're continuing to enhance our regionalism efforts. Our support for city road and bridge projects are just part of our regional programs. We've supported the consolidation and improvement of regional 911 call centers. We're continuing to expand our investments in community development projects. And this budget, for the first time, anticipates regionalizing jails across the county, which would save our local communities a lot of money. The right to vote is the bedrock foundation for our democracy, and it's also embedded in our county charter. The Federal Voting Rights Act also imposes responsibilities on counties to ensure the right of every citizen to vote. In this budget, through the creation of the position of a voting rights coordinator, we are fulfilling these responsibilities. This is still a relatively new government, barely 7 years old. A lot has changed. For one, the charter created a new emphasis on economic development, and we're still working out the kinks. This budget enables us to continue to restructure the office to better fit our expanded activity. And it funds the retention of a company for loan servicing, which should enable us to improve service and avoid some of the problems of the past. Under the new charter, a whole lot of independent offices with independently elected office holders, independent administrations, and independent computer systems were consolidated into our current government. This budget continues our work to implement the ERP project so that we can create a unified and updated computer system across the county government. This is a huge and critically important project. The merging of many independent government offices with vastly differing wage schedules has created inequities and morale problems within our new county government. The county is not an easy place in which to work. Many of our employees perform very tough, stressful jobs. It's tough spending your day trying to help people facing terrible problems and horrible traumas, such as grandparents with Alzheimer's disease, parents with addictions, and children who have been abused. We all want this county government to be an employer of choice, where people who work hard are treated fairly, and that they know that their efforts are appreciated. This budget begins the process to address these equity issues. This budget continues to fund our Innovation and Performance Office, which enables us to continue improving our internal operations and the way we serve the public. And by improving our procurement processes and efficiencies, we're saving money that helps fund this budget. Perhaps most important, this budget continues to provide and improve the social and human services needed by so many of our residents, especially the most vulnerable among us. This budget addresses the soaring needs in our community. In fact, we are budgeting more for social and human and health care services than ever in our county's history. I will speak more to the budgeting for social and health and human services in just a few minutes. So I'm very proud of what this budget accomplishes and what it represents. As you know, we've recently, and for the first time in the county's history, developed a comprehensive strategic plan covering all of the executive branch, which I think you've all had a chance to see. Remember, in creating this new government, multiple entirely independent offices were forcibly merged. Each office had their own plan or no plan. Each went their own separate way. This budget that I present to you today follows and implements the goals set forth in our strategic plan. As I said a few minutes ago, this budget will continue and enhance the great progress and momentum here in Cuyahoga County. But let me make one thing clear. This was and is a tough budget, presenting some serious financial challenges, thanks largely to the folks in Columbus and Washington. I can divide the challenges into three categories: direct revenue cuts, imposition of unfunded or underfunded mandates, and failure to help us address increasing needs. First and most harmful is the state's cut to our sales tax, which will result in a cut to our revenue of about $60 million over the biennium. A cut of this magnitude requires a brief explanation. Since 2011, the state has applied the sales tax to the sale of Medicaid managed care contracts. But the last federal administration determined that states could no longer tax just Medicaid managed care contracts. They could either tax all managed care contracts or no managed care contracts, but not just Medicaid managed care contracts. The Kasich administration decided to tax no managed care contracts. That results in lost sales tax revenues to the state of Ohio of about $600 million annually. And counties and public transit authorities, in addition, lose more than $200 million annually. But the state decided that it could not absorb a loss of $600 million. So they went back to the Obama administration and were able to get permission to levy a fee, not a tax, a fee on Medicaid managed care contracts. In other words, the state made up the entire $600 million it would have lost. In fact, the state actually came out a little bit ahead financially. But the sales tax that counties and transit organizations receive does not apply to fees. And the state did not ask the administration to make up the lost revenues to the counties and transit authorities. In other words, the state took care of its shortfall, but left us out in the cold. While projecting the loss of future sales taxes is always precarious, it appears that Cuyahoga County will lose about $60 million over the biennium, the 2 years. The state gave us $25 million as a one-time bridge, but that's like a bridge to nowhere. It's nowhere near enough. I do want to thank Senator Matt Dolan for his tremendous efforts to try to pass a permanent and complete fix for the counties and transit authorities. Ultimately, he was not successful, but it was certainly not for lack of trying. The sales tax is not the only cut we received from the state, by the way, but it's by far the largest. The second category of financial challenges is unfunded or underfunded mandates. Primary here is the prohibition on the courts to sentence persons convicted of felony 5 offenses to state prison, leaving the counties to deal with these criminals. The state allocated a meager amount of funds to help counties pay for these criminals in county jail or in the community. But the funds are woefully inadequate, leaving us to pick up any additional costs. The third category is the significant new challenges that we face, for which the state and federal governments have failed to provide resources. Primary here, as the chairman mentioned, are the costs associated with the opioid crisis. The opioid epidemic is an emergency, expected to break another record this year, taking more than 850 lives in Cuyahoga County. Just this weekend, John Coniglia of The Plain Dealer wrote an article entitled, "Cost of Opioid Epidemic Soars, Hitting Taxpayers Harder Than Ever." Maybe you saw it. It was online over the weekend. He quotes Brad Cole, the managing director for research at the County Commissioners Association of Ohio. Children's services costs are exploding around the state. He also notes that medical expenses in jails are straining the system. The number of children in foster care, the number of days they must spend in foster care, the number and the costs for placement and treatment of children in foster care is going through the roof. In the last 5 years, the number of children in Cuyahoga County who were born exposed to drugs has increased from 289 to more than 500 expected this year, and that increases costs as well. 850 deaths, skyrocketing human and social service needs. This is an emergency, not unlike the emergencies that result from hurricanes or floods. President Trump has said this is a national emergency, but he has not officially declared a national emergency, which means that we've not seen any additional resources. I should mention that we've been very active advocating with our state and federal governments on opioids, as well as on a whole range of issues. We need help that we're just not getting. While our advocacy efforts have been met more with frustration than success, we will continue to work and educate and fight in Columbus and Washington for our county's residents. In response to the growing needs from the opioid crisis and other needs resulting from other addictions and mental illness and an aging population, we're budgeting more for health, human, and social services than ever before in our county's history. We cannot leave our most vulnerable citizens, those most in need, we cannot leave them behind. So yes, we faced significant financial challenges in crafting this budget, but we've balanced the budget. And we've done so in a way that continues to move the county forward without cutting those services that are so vital to our residents who are most in need. And by the way, it should be noted, we balanced the budget without raising taxes. I think that's worth repeating. Despite escalating costs and needs, there are no new taxes here. I'd like to take a moment for a few thank yous. Producing such a strong budget would not have been possible without the cooperation of all of our chiefs and our department heads. We asked them to be creative and to be resourceful, and they have been. That's not to say that they were overjoyed, but they did their best to achieve these great outcomes. Our partners outside the executive branch, the courts and the prosecutor in particular, have also worked very productively with us. Again, while no one is particularly happy, we've achieved agreed upon budgets with each of them. Budgets which enable them to continue to fully and humanely serve justice. I very much appreciate their help. I want to thank Chief of Staff Sharon Sobel Jordan and Fiscal Officer Dennis Kennedy for leading this budget effort. And most important, I want to thank our OBM Director, Maggie Keenan, and her team for their tireless work to bring this budget home. OBM has been working right up to this minute. In fact, I think they're still working to finalize this budget. So I have to say, I told Maggie I would say if there's any typos or any miscalculation errors, it's probably my fault. So how were we able to accomplish this strong budget despite some severe financial challenges and revenue cuts? I'll highlight some of the most significant aspects of this budget, and then I'll turn it over to Maggie Keenan, who can give you a lot more detail. First, I should note that this budget assumes that after removing the Medicaid managed care sales tax revenue, the smaller amount of remaining sales taxes will increase by 2% per year. That's our estimate. We're also incorporating a 2% annual COLA for employees. All right, now, this budget cuts costs in a variety of different ways. You may recall that a couple of years ago, we invested $4.5 million with Jumpstart to support startup and early stage businesses. that proved to be a great move, a really great move. Thanks to a very profitable exit of one of the companies supported by Jumpstart, we this year received our entire $4.5 million back, and we still remain in the Jumpstart program, which will benefit the county in the event of future business exits. We're using the $4.5 million that we received back to reduce our subsidy to economic development in this budget, while still increasing our support for job creation. During the Great Recession, Northeast Ohio was hit particularly hard, and our residents suffered terribly with foreclosed and abandoned homes. These blighted properties made it impossible for neighbors to sell their homes, and property values on entire streets and neighborhoods were impacted. The county recognized the problem and took action. Over the last 2.5 years, and for the rest of this year, we will have awarded and paid out about $33 million to demolish about 2,400 blighted properties. We had committed a total of $50 million. But at the time we began this demolition program, we did not anticipate the availability of substantial federal hardest hit funds, which I want to thank my friend Jim Rokakis for his great help in obtaining. With the addition of the hardest hit funds, as well as the City of Cleveland's new neighborhood initiative, and the homes annually demolished by the Land Bank, which I note we support financially, we can now anticipate that without additional county resources, there exists more than enough funds to eliminate the remaining blighted properties through 2020. For that reason, we can delay budgeting additional demo funds at this time and save about $17 million over the biennium. However, it should be noted, if our calculations turn out not to be borne out for any reason, we remain committed to the demo program and we will adjust our funds accordingly. Eliminating blighted properties is not our sole housing need. Under the leadership of Ken Surratt and working closely with all of the housing organizations and advocates throughout the county, we've developed a comprehensive housing plan, which should improve neighborhoods throughout Northeast Ohio. To begin the implementation of this plan, this budget proposes moving $3 million, which was previously planned for demo, into a housing fund, which can be used for other housing needs, such as foreclosure prevention, low-interest home repair loans, small low-income housing projects, down payment assistance, and lead abatement. And if further funds are needed for residential demolition during this time period, these funds could also be used for that. We believe we can save money on procurement, on the contracts and purchases we make. Ernst & Young confirmed this for the county. Our Innovation and Performance Office has developed our Purchasing Transformation Project, implementing reverse auctions, reducing purchase cycle times, and using our buying power to cut costs. We anticipate saving at least $2 million in this budget cycle. We continue to consolidate where it makes sense to create efficiencies and save money, and to eliminate positions that are no longer needed as they become vacant. The food and medical services at the jail are expensive. We're anticipating that we can save $1.9 million per year by adjusting the way those services are handled. And we're reducing our budget for the capital improvements plan to better fit our actual capacity to undertake these projects. Now, as I explained earlier, we have skyrocketing needs in health and human services. So how are we filling those needs? First, we're doing everything legally possible to leverage more federal funds, and we are being successful at doing that. We have worked closely with the leadership in our HHS departments to carefully identify very targeted, and I emphasize very targeted budget cuts that can be made without impacting services. These are focused mostly on eliminating historic underspends and consolidating and/or eliminating positions as vacancies occur. However, in order to make sure that we're in fact not harming services, we're setting aside a reserve fund equal to the amount of these reductions for underspends and vacancies. If the anticipated savings cannot be achieved without negatively impacting needed services, then we'll draw down on this reserve fund. While we don't think that we'll actually have to draw down this fund, our remaining HHS reserves would still be well above the council required threshold if we have to do so. We have also focused on increasing revenues. As I said, we're leveraging more federal dollars wherever possible. While our advocacy efforts to fix the sales tax cuts were not successful, we were able to convince the state legislature to give us a little more flexibility with respect to our investments. That, plus a rising interest environment, adds about $2 million to revenue in the biennium. I mentioned our regionalization of the county jail. Once we've integrated the prisoners from the city of Cleveland, we will then offer to take prisoners from cities across the county. This will allow cities to save a lot of money by getting out of the jail business. And we'll be able to increase revenues to cover costs at the jail. In this budget, we're anticipating added revenues of $5.5 million over the biennium. We can also add to our revenues by better collecting outstanding and overdue economic development loans and by more efficiently collecting unpaid property taxes. Current state law establishes a rental registry and requires landlords to register leases, which is intended to empower cities to enforce housing, health, and building requirements. The law is not being well enforced. By better enforcing this law, we will help our cities and at the same time generate added revenue to support the fiscal and treasurer's office, revenue of about $3.5 million over the biennium. And finally, we're spending down our PA funds, and we're using a portion of the Medicaid managed care transition funds as anticipated by the state. That creates an off-ramp using $16.5 million over the biennium and retaining the rest in reserves for 2020. While I would prefer not to use PA funds or one-time MCO funds, our forward planning should help us avoid problems in the future. We're continuing to find and create savings of taxpayer dollars, and I anticipate that we'll continue to do this each and every year. In the last 2.5 years, we've already saved the taxpayers over $100 million. And I anticipate the implementation of the ERP project will generate substantial additional savings, which we cannot yet quantify or budget, but which are likely to help in the next budget cycle. Now, I understand this is just a high-level overview of our budget for 18 and 19. As you'll hear more from Maggie and from our directors over the coming weeks, this is a good and a strong budget, and it is balanced. It continues our strong forward momentum as a county while investing in our future. It serves to implement our county strategic plan, which embodies our mission, our vision, and our values. I am proud to submit it to you for your consideration. And of course, if you just want to vote yes, we all save a lot of time and go home. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Executive. Does anyone have any questions specifically for the executive? Ms. Brown?
Thank you for the presentation, County Executive Budish. I was just curious about a couple of things. You mentioned the voting rights coordinator on page 3.
Yes.
I was just wondering, is this position filled? Is it temporary? And how long would they serve? Would it be something, could you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
So actually, a week or two ago, we announced a voting rights project that we're engaged in as county government. We have established a desk, a location within the Virgil Brown Building to start, where people, hopefully as they come in, will be engaged to register to vote if they're not already registered, or to update their address if it's not updated. That desk will be staffed by volunteers. We're working with NOVA and with the League of Women Voters and a couple other organizations that have committed to provide volunteers to staff that location, and if we can move it into other locations as well, we will do so. The role of the coordinator, you have to have somebody to coordinate if you're doing volunteers and relying on volunteers. That's the primary work of that person. It is designed, it's being budgeted, and the expectation it will be a permanent and continuing position. It has not been filled. I do not believe it's been bid yet.
Thank you very much. And then I had another question. I just have to find it. I'm sorry. The funding for the demolition fund money that we received from the federal government, can you elaborate how much that money was? Do we know how
I
the
don't
dollar
have
figure?
the exact amount. I'm sure Ken Surratt will be able to give that to you when he appears. But it's tens and tens of millions of dollars. It's like 30, 40, 50 million for this. It's a lot of money. And that plus Cleveland has adopted a small but useful program. And the land bank demolishes something like 500 properties a year just in the normal course. When you take all that, we've gotten the numbers from the advocates as to how many homes are left that are still abandoned and foreclosed and blighted. And the numbers indicate that we've got more than enough funds in the system, thanks largely to the hardest hit funds.
Okay, and then two more questions. The 1.9 million that you spoke about with the food and medical
And I
service.
believe, by the way, the hardest hit funds have to be spent, I believe, by the end of 2020. So if we don't use those funds,
We lose
then
them.
we lose them.
Okay. The 1.9 million for food and medical services at the jail, you said you were adjusting the way those services will be handled. Are they currently outsourced, and are we looking to do them in-house, or is there something you can elaborate on?
Sure. The food is entirely in-house. The healthcare is provided largely by Metro Health right now. The jail director has engaged in some conversations which indicate that it looks like we could have another organization come in and do the healthcare at a significantly less cost and as good or better service. Not that Metro's doing well, but Metro doesn't do jails. For example, there's one company currently that does jail hospital services for Franklin County, for Hamilton County, and for Montgomery County. Okay. So there are businesses out there that focus on providing health care for jails. They know how to do it. They know how to do it efficiently. And we've gotten some idea of prices. We would not just pick somebody, we would put it out for RFP. But based on the preliminary conversations that have been had, it looks like there's some substantial savings available there.
Okay, my last question is an understand.
And we've talked to Metro, by the way, and if they can come in and do it for less, we're happy to have them continue to do it. They're performing good service. It's not that they're not.
Okay. The underspend, can you give me an example when you touched on in HHS, I believe it was, what a historic underspend might be?
Yeah, there's a list, and again, Maggie can go through that with you, but there's a number of areas where the funds just haven't been spent over the years, and yet they continue to be budgeted. It makes no sense to continue to do that. I think the reason they're always budgeted is because if we ever need it, it's nice to have the money there, but that's why we're committing to segregate a portion of the reserve that is equal to the amount of all those cuts totaled together, so that if we need to spend the money, we are committed to do that. We're not going to cut service.
Okay, I know I said that was my last question, but I do have one more.
Oh, you lie.
I'm sorry. I guess it just seems counterintuitive adopting the other jail systems from the city. You said that will generate revenue for us. Can you just kind of explain to me how that generates revenue by doing that, taking it away from the cities and us taking on that responsibility? And I promise that is my last question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, the answer is that the city of Cleveland is by far the largest. I think it's about 175 prisoners that we'll be getting from the city when this goes through. We will be hiring on additional people for that. We will be putting in additional infrastructure to make that happen. We'll be also funding some improvements at the Bedford Heights Jail to make that happen. Once that's done, we can open it up to other cities, charge the exact same amount per prisoner that we're charging the city of Cleveland, and at that point, you start to get some benefits of the numbers. So you don't have to add as many new employees each time you add new prisoners once you get to a certain point. So that's how we will be able to actually add positive revenue.
Thank you.
And help the cities at the same time.
For the record, Councilman Hairston has joined us. Thank you very much. And Ms. Conwell is next.
Through the chair to the executive, on page 8, you stated there was a second category of financial challenges in regards to the felony 5 offenses. So am I to understand that because of the change of the law with the felonies 5, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't remember what the felony 5 offenses are, that they will now be housed in the county jails? Is that?
Well, they'll either be housed in the county jails or they'll be community, through the ankle bracelets or other things. The idea is to get them out of prison, out of jail. But to do that, there's additional costs. We are the ones now that are being forced to bear those additional costs.
Okay, so there were requests from the Public Defender's Department, and they have needs. So have you given it any thought if we help them and bring them to parity, that they could also help in terms of keeping some of those individuals out of our prisons where we could actually save some money?
Well, first of all, the public defender does a great job, and we have been funding the public defender, we have received a request. It is not in this budget to increase their budget because of the financial strains that we have. I think that we can do what we need to do without increasing the public defender budget. We have committed to work with them to help them get some grants for some of the technology and equipment that they've asked for, and I think that we'll be able to help them in that way.
Okay. And also on page 10, you said I should mention that we have been very active advocating for our state and federal governments in terms of the opiate addiction, which is a national public emergency. Mm-hmm. So just want to make sure that we already don't have enough funding in terms of the Adams Board to make sure that, since we all recognize that it is a major catastrophe, that we are not going to decrease the Adams Board budget in any way.
There's no cut to the Adams Board in this budget.
All right, thank you.
Councilman Hairston.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. To the executive, thank you for the overview of the proposed budget. And just to
And let me if I can interrupt you for a minute, Councilman, just to give the Councilwoman an idea. So the way we did this budget, we looked at the total deficit. We went to clusters of departments within our executive side. We didn't go to each department, but we went to groups, of departments, and we said, "Look, here's your budget compared to the total budget of the county. It's X percent, 8% or 10%, whatever it is." And we calculated what the total shortfall we were expecting for this biennium, and then we told them, "Look, your percentage is 8%. You should help us figure out 8% of the deficit, either through cuts or revenue." It was never intended to be an across-the-board cut. We always intended, and in fact did, exercise discretion, but we had to give them some guidance as to where to start. So we told them this is what the deficit is, and this is what we hope you'll be able to help us with. We also went to the outside organizations to do the same thing. We went to the courts, we went to the prosecutor, and others. We went to the public defender. We went to all of the outside organizations. We also spent a lot of time internally looking for across the county type either cuts or revenues that could help us balance this budget, which then meant, since we found a lot, that we were able to not impose, any kind of across the board. We could exercise discretion, and that's exactly what we did. So some agencies can handle more in the way of a reduction, some can handle less. We took that into consideration. We talked at length, negotiated at length with the courts, and came up with, as I said, agreed upon budgets, which were substantially less in most cases than what their percentage would be if applied. And for the Adams Board, we came up with 0 because of this, the situation we're in. We never asked them for a cut, and we did not get a cut. So they are fully funded. The public defender, we also went to and said, this is what we're doing across the board, asking for, but we're not asking for you for any cut. So any agency that's not getting a cut is, ahead of the game in this budget, because we do have to come up with a whole lot of money due to the sales tax and other challenges we have.
Okay,
sorry.
and we're back to Councilman Hairston.
Thank you. Only you today, I'll let you interrupt me like that. Well, again, just executive, thank you for the overview of the proposed budget. And, this, from the executive office and this council have really been able to achieve some great things and have done some great work. And we've made many commitments, and we've kept with those commitments, all right? And I'm deeply concerned that we are not going to set aside or allocate the additional funding for the demolition program that we made a commitment on. At the very least, we sat here, we voted, and we made a commitment that we were going to fund $50 million to support the communities by allowing for this fund to be created so we can get rid of these vacant and abandoned properties in our community. Mm-hmm. From the reports that you've seen has indicated, because of the federal funds and what you say, the small but helpful budget that the city has passed to deal with demolition, is enough for us to really make that mark in the communities, and it'll be enough based on the number of vacant abandoned properties that are left, that it will be simply enough. But the reports that I've seen, the conversations I've heard through my committee and over time, that it is not enough, that we will not get to that place where we get to the place where we're doing good, but it won't eliminate all of or at least where we are within striking distance the number of vacant properties that still line our streets, that folks are sleeping next to, that folks are living next to every single day. For example, there's a building that's in my district now that don't qualify under the hardest hit funds because it's too large. It's a commercial structure. It has hot asbestos inside of it. It has remediations anywhere between $50,000 to $75,000. The building itself is going to cost upwards of $50,000. So without the demolition program that we have to aid that program, then the building won't come down. So what do we do with situations like that, where the city of Cleveland budget is not large enough to, or even if it's not in the city of Cleveland, to support those type of needed demolitions, or the hardest hit funds, fund money that's there because of the restrictions or the land bank's restrictions won't allow them to tear it down? I think we're setting ourselves up. I think that we really need to relook at this, and I'll ask this council that we really look at this before making a decision on what we're doing, because I don't see this as a help. I see this as a hurt to the communities. And I think I know the reports that were put out were based on our $50 million, the hardest hit funds, and the city of Cleveland's small but helpful money that they've set aside in their past budget cycle, will continue to help us get to where we're trying to go. So, I'm concerned about, not fulfilling our commitment, on the surface to these communities of allocating $50 million. And it's just to Mrs. Campbell's point about, the funding for the public defender's office. So many times in the community, and especially communities that some of us represent, you hear about, the public defender's office, don't go there because they won't represent you the way they should. We know that that's not the case. We know they have some very capable, outstanding, fantastic attorneys there who do amazing work on behalf of the folks that they serve every single day. But how do we believe that a public defender's office can really represent their clients if they do not have the proper technology? I understand we're going to help them with grants, or even the staffing capacity, and not on the same level as the prosecutor's office, but at least to have additional staff who may not have to run from courtroom to courtroom throughout the day, who barely have time to read all the cases, who are just simply walking up and representing people. That's a problem. And so we're talking about the true access to justice, or the commitment to these folks who come in that door every single day, who we must provide must provide good representation on behalf of those folks. And I'm concerned that with the capacity levels that are there, we're doing an okay job now, but can we do better? Absolutely, we can. And so, we'll have a conversation. We'll be talking with the administration about the public defender's office. Thank you.
Let me just say one thing is, clearly, there's a lot of needs in this community. And the needs are much greater than our revenue or our capacity. We're doing, I think, pretty well at what we're doing. I do not have a printing machine in the basement of this building, unless there's one that I didn't see when I came in, to print money. So without that, any changes that this council want to make, I'm very open to. But you got to find the money if you're restoring funds for something else or putting funds in, because we don't have a printing machine to come up with more. And I think when you hear the details, and again, it's better to have somebody like Ken Surratt talk about the housing situation. He's been meeting regularly. I don't know if it's daily, but certainly weekly and monthly with all of the housing groups and advocates, and he's comfortable that we do have enough money in the system right now to take down the foreclosed and abandoned homes that are out there. And the other piece is, if we spend more money and we're right that the homes are done, then that means that we're going to be returning a lot of hard-to-hit funds to the federal government, which would be a shame in light of our needs in this community.
And I appreciate that. I think just from what I see in driving around the community and just knowing what's in the pipeline to come down, or what folks are really or working on to come down. I represent one of the most impoverished cities in Ohio, East Cleveland. So and I see the number of properties that are still standing. We conversate, we talk to the city and the land bank on a regular basis about the structures that are still standing, and the time it's going to take to get some of those down. But they still stand. So, and we could talk about this, and I get it. And we can have further conversations. I know Ken has been doing some great work with the housing folks, but I don't see it. I don't think that we have really made that mark that we were hoping to make. Well, listen, we're making great progress. Don't get me wrong, but the need is still so great. And I know we don't have a printing machine, but these are some of the most pressing needs of the people who we represent. It's the vacant abandoned properties, it's the folks who walk in that office, the public defender's office, and those are the need of the people that I represent. Those some of the need. And so I wanted to be clear on the record that I made my concerns with those two things that you presented today.
And when you look around, there's still a lot of homes out there that are foreclosed and abandoned that need to be taken down. I'm not suggesting we're there today. All I'm saying is that based on what the experts have told us, there's enough money in the system to do that by 2020.
Ms. Conwell has one more question, followed by Vice President Jones.
Through the chair to executive, just a point on Councilman Harrison's thing. I believe we have an obligation not to assist the pipeline to prison. So we, as a county.
Not to assist, I'm sorry, I didn't follow.
Pipeline to prison. So we need to give an equitable solution of the public defender's office and the prosecutor's office. I know you're asking the departments that can afford possibly to cut their budget, and I'm assuming that would probably be the prosecutor's office. why wasn't that thought of in terms of to give parity to the public defender's office? So I'm just letting you know that I understand that you're in a hard position, and we are too, in order to look over all this because of the cuts that we have to face. But then we're also offering new programs and things of that nature when we can't even take care of our basic things that we're supposed to do. You know, that's the right that they're supposed to have good public defenders on their behalf. And just talking to the prosecutor's office, there's certain things that we're not doing for those individuals that come before. I was at a female's house last night, and she was talking to me, I guess because I'm on having a domestic violence series about her son and how he got caught up in the system because he didn't have the funds to have his own lawyer, and that the public defender's office couldn't do a proper job in keeping a young man that they clearly found out afterward and after being sentenced that the female in this case has set him up, so to speak. And by them not having the proper investigators, we're losing somebody that's going to be in the system that can't produce taxes. So we really need to look at these things. So I know you're in a hard, difficult position, but, you know, and I wish we could all say that, you know, yes to this budget that you propose. I'm just letting you know there'll be some deeper conversation in terms from me about certain areas. Thank you.
Sure. And I would just note that the prosecutor has agreed to $1.5 million cut in this budget per year.
Vice President Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Executive, one, thank you for the presentation. Sure. It was actually very thorough, and to hear your perspective and your detailed insight into the overall budget. I'll say this, as my colleague and Councilman Hairston has mentioned, the demolition has been an important part of what we've been doing. And to go back history-wise, let me just say this. We did anticipate, when we brought the $50 million forward, we did anticipate if we put skin in the game first, there would be opportunities to get more dollars. The professionals at that time did feel in, we didn't get a hard number, but $250 million was a number thrown around as what the genuine need was, and we had 50. So when the 70 million came in, it was definitely, it wasn't, we didn't see it we saw it on the horizon, we just didn't know where it would come from. And that 70 million from the state and what Caucus brought forward was definitely a help. I like that you say that if the time comes when it's needed, it's still there. So I appreciate that. And I know it's not just your challenge, it's our challenge. 11 of us have to look at the overall budget. We just can't say yes, but we just can't say no either. Those are both
That was a joke when I said
know.
just say yes.
Yeah. So we certainly were going to roll up our sleeves and do our part. But I also say I like the concept that you have of the additional housing needs. It's a good initial step. I've had a chance to talk with Ken. You know, we've had the committee meeting. I like to see that fleshed out more, and that will happen over time. But it is a good next step because rehab is important. Rehab is the next logical step.
Right.
We've described the demolition needs as a few bad apples and a bag of good apples. You don't pull out the few bad, you'll make a lot more rotten over time. So the quick strike of demolition was important.
Right.
And if we can save many houses and not demolish, I believe you've laid down a foundation that with development could help in the rehab area. In the area of the public defender, you've also heard it, so I'm just going to echo it. The parity between the prosecutors and the public defenders is not there. The public defenders have not had an increase, I believe, in over 10 years. They've maintained where they are for a very long time. And I'll just say that that's something that needs to be considered even as we move forward. Let's see. And you know what? I'll stop there. those are two major points. For the overview, I'll save my more penetrating questions for others.
And again, just to make it clear, I am with you 100% on the importance of the demolition and tearing down the blighted homes. All I'm saying is it appears that there's enough other money. If it turns out otherwise, we're there, we'll come back in. It's not terminating the program, it's just delaying the funding, additional funding while we use up the other funds.
So the 17 million of the 33 have gone to demolition. 17 is what's left unused. You've dedicated 3 towards the additional housing needs.
Correct.
How has your budget dealt with the other 17? Is it still sitting there for potentially to be
No,
used?
I
or
mean, it's
how have you
being
chosen?
spent as part of the budget. We have all these huge needs out there that
Right.
we have to fill. But, we have, we have reserves, we have ability to generate more funds through other things that we're looking at. So I'm confident that if we need more, we'll come up with more. And we didn't, when the council passed the 50 million, it was originally anticipated it was going to be a bond issue, which, given our debt, we decided was not the best approach. So we found the money as we went along, and we'll continue to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Simon?
Thank you. Thank you, Executive Budish, for your thoughtful budget presented to us. And I wanted, first of all, to say thank you in particular for the voting person there to make sure that there's voting opportunities in Cuyahoga County and that we're not going to be faced with the suppression. I have to say I authored the charter amendment, and I'm really pleased to see that it's going to be taken seriously. So thank you for that. I look forward to working with whoever's going to be in charge of that. I'm going to be looking at the Public Defender's Office. I've been looking at the inequities there since I got on this council seat. Every year, the prosecutor's office was looking for increases for very worthy causes, but the public defender's office has been stagnant. And the example, I don't need to get into it, that I've always asked is about the actual technology and laptop computers that they don't have enough money to fund that. So they would be going over to the prosecutor's tables during trials, getting information and the evidence and exhibits by way of the prosecutor's equipment. So I would really be looking at increasing that funding. If we really want criminal justice reform, this is where it starts. We can have all the bail reform programs without counsel sitting at the front end of this for the defendants. They're not going to find their way clear where they need to go. So I'll look at that. And also regionalization. That's been a primary objective of this council from day one. I want to make sure that's funded appropriately and that we're maximizing every opportunity to help our communities. And we've been doing a good job of that, but I'll be just making sure that we continue to come up with innovative ways to help them beside roads and bridges, and which we desperately need. So those are my 3 comments, and thank you for presenting this to us. I look forward to working with you.
Great. I think we're announcing soon, University Heights, et cetera, is that?
Yeah, next Tuesday is the opening of the Cleveland Heights, University Heights, Shaker Heights, South Euclid. It's called the Hillcrest Heights Regional Dispatch Center. Tuesday
So
afternoon.
we're focused on regional activity, highly focused. And again, the jail regionalization is the biggest thing we've ever done in regionalization in the county, and hopefully it'll be successful.
Mr. Chair, to the executive, we've been working on that. I'm so glad to see that it's done, and Councilman Gallagher's been working on that, and that's just a start. I mean, this is really a key to the success of the county, is to make sure our local communities are able to function soundly and fiscally, have the ability fiscally to maintain their services. So this is something I'm going to be looking at, not just with dispatch and safety, but other areas, is even the healthcare. I mean, what we really need to reexamine what's going on with that.
Good.
Okay.
One thing I would ask, there's been some rumor, I've heard some people talking about the public defender and how we should take money from the prosecutor and give it to the public defender. I would ask council not to do that, because we have come up with an agreement with the prosecutor. He is taking a $1.5 million cut. And when I go to these outside groups, whether it's the prosecutor or the public defender or the courts, and I try to make a deal, it's a deal. And at least from my perspective, when there's an agreement, and So I want to, he was good enough to come up with an agreement that I think was fair. So I would ask the council not to take money from there.
Okay, Mr. Executive, we thank you very much for your detailed presentation and for the responses to the questions from my colleagues. And at this point, we're going to excuse you. And,
Thank you.
And we're going to bring forward Ms. Keenan to give us the numbers in greater detail.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
Good
Abby
afternoon.
Keenan, Office
Welcome.
of Budget and Management. So just, this is a presentation that's going to look familiar on what I do every time I come up here. Interrupt me if I would prefer that than going too far off topic. Okay. So starting with the general fund. One more disclaimer before we start, that the numbers that are in the presentation today for 2017 are the projections from second quarter. OBM is working on third quarter projections. We hope to have those finished tomorrow, actually. So when we present you the executive's recommended budget book, you'll have third quarter numbers, but we just needed a couple more days, so I couldn't include them today. But I'll let you know if there are notable differences. For the 2018-2019 general fund budget, as the executive mentioned, both years we are balanced, so revenue exceeds total expenditures. In 2018, we're looking to spend about $372 million in the general fund. This is slightly less than what we're projecting to spend in 2017. In 2019, expenses increased to $385 million. The increase is largely attributed to increase in payroll costs, so we are assuming a 2% increase on all salaries, bargaining and non-bargaining, an increase in the employer share of hospitalization costs, and then also, as the executive mentioned, the increase to the Economic Development Fund in 2019. That's not going to take place in 2018. Looking at revenue, for 2018 and 19, we are assuming a 2% increase in sales tax. This is a 2% increase on the sales tax less the MCO. So we went back a couple of years and took out all the MCO and see where we'd been. For the last 3 or 4 years, we've been averaging an increase of about 3.5% in sales tax. So the 2% is, we're thinking, conservative, and that we will be able to meet that. This budget does anticipate the transfer of $7.5 million from the 0.25% fund to the general operating fund. That's $2 million more than what we're transferring this year. I can talk about that in a little bit when we go to the 0.25% fund, but we feel like that's sustainable. Charges for services is increasing slightly in 2018 from 2017. This is largely attributed to the rental registry that the executive mentioned. We're assuming a large one-time payment in 2018 of about $3 million, and then on annual revenue on an ongoing basis of about $500,000. And I think the $500,000 is conservative. We compared it to the other urban counties who all have fees that are lower than ours, and they're bringing in more than $500,000. So we feel like this is a justifiable number. This also includes the revenue that we expect to bring in from regionalizing corrections. What we've anticipated in the budget assumes a 70% capacity. So we are assuming that we won't be fully, have full capacity with the prisoners. If we're at 100%, the revenue will increase. We are also anticipating using the MCO transition payment. We're going to apportion this over 3 years. This is reflected in the miscellaneous revenue. That's $4 million in 2018, $12.5 million in 2019, and $8.5 million in 2020. This does not anticipate any additional revenue from the states talking about giving out another $50 million statewide. This does not anticipate we would get that money. So if that passes and the county gets its share, which should probably be about $4 or $5 million, that would be on top of this. There are some one-time revenue sources in the budget, just to make you aware. In 2018, we are assuming $4.5 million in the transfer of unclaimed funds that legally can transfer to the general fund. That will drop to $250,000 in 2019 and 2020. The $3 million from the rental registry that I mentioned previously. We are also going to transfer $3 million of surplus cash in old capital project accounts into the general fund in 2018. If you recall, at second quarter, we had presented to council an update on the capital projects. We've been doing a cleanup of these projects for about a year. And what we have found is that we have a number of projects that had not been funded at all, so they had negative cash balances, and then a number of projects that were overfunded. So the projects ended up costing less than what they originally estimated, but we had funded them in full. So when we balanced everything out, we have positive $3 million that can come back to the general fund. And then finally, we are anticipating a $2 million transfer from the road and bridge funds to the 0.25% fund. This is to reimburse for work that done on the tunnel between the garage and the Hilton Hotel. And we will then transfer that $2 million from the 0.25% fund to the general operating fund. The next slide looks at revenue just by source. I think I've touched on most of this, just a few other comments. One, in property taxes, we're not assuming any increase in property taxes in either 2018 or 2019, but we do want to note that the sexennial appraisal is next year, which will impact 2019 revenue. Also, we have some general obligation debt that matures in 2020. So the way we split property taxes between debt service and the general operating fund will favor the general operating fund by $5 million in 2020 and then another $8 million in 2021. So the future gets better for property taxes. For sales tax, like I mentioned, we're assuming the 2% increase in both year. Fines and forfeitures, I'm assuming a slight increase in revenue generated by juvenile court. This is based on the plan that the court submitted to the executive and council in order to have their wage implementation, the wage study implemented. And then I'm assuming a decrease of about 5% in the clerk of courts, so that's revenue generated in the common pleas court. Case filings in the civil division are down, and that's largely who's paying. So we've seen an increase over the last couple of years in criminal filings, but by and large, the criminal defendants aren't paying their fees. I think about 85% are indigent. So that revenue has been steadily decreasing for the last several years. Charges for services, I already touched on. There's no change to the local government fund and the state budget. I'm not assuming any change in how much money the county is going to bring in. We are assuming the 45% reimbursement rate from the state public defender. That's an increase from what we were receiving at the beginning of the year, but it's a decrease from the 48% that we were receiving all last year. Investment earnings, we're expecting to see about $1 million increase in each year. This is based on the investments that we have that are maturing in each year, and we anticipate being able to reinvest them at higher rates. No change to licenses and permits, and the miscellaneous revenue I've already talked about. The demo fund, this comes into play in 2019, is the $9 million in the demo fund cash balance that makes up the $17 million. We're anticipating transferring that back in 2019.
Ms. Keenan, on the MCO transition in 2018, is it 6 million as stated on this page or 4 million?
It's $4 million.
It's 4, okay,
I'm going to blame Armin for that one.
okay. Okay,
It's 412 and then
okay, fine,
8.5.
okay.
Any questions on revenue?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
I know that we've been talking about the increase in the $5 motor vehicle sales tax. Now, does that what does that fall in one of the categories we have here? We anticipate it for the future, or
We are reflecting that, but that's in the road and bridge fund.
For the road and
So it
bridge
wouldn't
fund,
be in the general fund, but that won't take effect until 2019. I think we're expecting a small amount of money to come in the last few months of 2018, but it's $5 million in 2019.
okay? Thank you.
But that's all funds, not general fund.
Ms. Keenan, could you say a little bit more about the $4.5 million in unclaimed funds and where that comes from and what kind of things that consists of?
I'm going to let Dennis talk about that.
Okay, thanks.
Good afternoon. Mr. Chair, the financial statements carry a reserve for any outstanding warrants that the county has. And in Ohio law, after 5 years, you can transfer any remaining balance in that fund to your general fund. We'll still have to make good on any applications for payments that are justified, but we don't need to have those funds restricted after 5 years. So right now, a look back of 5 years, we have approximately $4.5 million that will be available at the beginning of next year to transfer back to the general fund.
So these are monies that people paid in and were entitled to get back, but they didn't get them back?
That's correct.
Okay.
Payments to people that were never cashed.
Okay. Okay. Ms. Simon?
Just a question related to that. How does that compare to past amounts that we've collected on our last budget cycle with regard to these unclaimed funds?
We've never actually executed a transfer back to the general fund. This is basically an accumulated balance that's made up of a lot of prior years.
Okay. I don't remember that, so that's why I asked. So, good.
But it is eligible to be used by the general fund. In some cases, some of these warrants are years and years and years old. So we just feel at this particular point in time, as long as we have protection in place to make sure that we honor anything that comes through correctly, we should be using the money for the needs we have now as opposed to having it restricted.
They're estimating after the transfer of the 4.5 million in back collections that it would be typically 250,000 a year each year thereafter. So this money is collected for quite a while. So it's going to give
Mr.
us.
Chair, those are conservative estimates moving forward. We're also looking at other opportunities, particularly for larger claims, to try and make a proactive attempt to contact folks to make sure that they know that they're entitled to this money.
So we're going to get a one-time benefit. Any other questions on revenue? Vice President Jones? You said on revenue? Yes. Okay. Okay. So, okay. Please proceed.
Do you have a question on the unclaimed funds?
I had a general question, but the chairman wasn't on revenue.
We'll let you ask it. Please proceed.
As the executive stated, one of our biggest financial challenges was the courts being blocked from sending it to the states. So that was as an unfunded mandate or underfunded mandate. Are there some smaller areas of unfunded that you could share with us? What are some of the other areas of either underfunding or unfunded mandates?
How much time do you have?
Maybe just the two or three of the
That's the
bigger
biggest
ones after
one
the
for this
biggest one.
budget. So the TCAP is the biggest impact that we have in terms of, nothing else has substantially changed. So we have a ton of unfunded mandates from the state and the feds. But the TCAP is a big one. And we're not anticipating right now any additional expenses in the general fund, but where you will see a drawdown is in the court's special revenue fund. So Common Police, they'll probably talk about this, I imagine, but Common Police Court has a probation supervision fees fund that had a pretty large cash balance, I think about 2 million at the beginning of the year, that they're using that now so that they can do the ankle bracelets and keep people on home detention and to pay for some community-based sanctions, so putting people in like halfway houses because they can't go to prison anymore, and there's only so much room that we have in our own jail. But that money's time limited. So while the problems associated with TCAP, I think in general, it's probably a really great program. It's good for society. It complements reentry. But in terms of the budget, I think in 2019 or 20 is when we might start to see we might have to make some changes. But it won't be in 18,
So would you say the majority of these unfunded or underfunded mandates find themselves in the arena, the court arena?
A lot of them are, but they're spread really throughout the county, from general government activities and health and human services. Okay, because we are, especially on the health and human services side, we're mandated to do a number of things, obviously, and we only get a certain percentage of reimbursement. On average, it's about 50%, so the county's picking up the other 50% for a $400 million program, $500 million program.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, you may continue.
Okay. So looking at expenditures now, for the general fund, in 2018, as I mentioned, we're looking at about $372 million, $385 million in 2019. Personnel remains our largest expense. It represents about 2/3 of the total general operating fund budget. 47% of our FTEs are under the authority of the county executive, 43% under other elected officials, so that's largely the courts and the prosecutor's office, and then 10% in the independent boards and commissions. For expenditures, what we did with the base budgets is we really didn't make substantial changes from 2017. So I mentioned we did apply a cost of living to salaries. We are assuming an increase in the hospitalization costs, but other than that, unless there was an expense that we were aware was going to be coming in 18 or 19 or a contract that we knew was going to be increasing, we have not applied any inflationary increases to this budget. Questions on expenses? I'll talk about it a little bit more detail on the next page.
Okay.
So the next page separates our expenditures by program. This is the first page of the schedules that we usually send out. General government expenditures are projected to increase in 2018 and hold steady in 2019. There was a reduction applied to the fiscal office, $300,000, assuming there were going to be some personnel savings resulting from the implementation of the ERP and the new real property system. The PRC is in general government. There was a $200,000 reduction applied to the budget for the PRC, and there was a slight increase in the budget for information and technology in both years. Justice and public safety expenditures are projected to increase slightly in 2018 and then by about $6 million more in 2019. This is a personnel-heavy budget, so this increase is largely just the 2% and the increase, in hospitalization costs. We did have reductions to all of the county courts. The State Court of Appeals was exempt from the reductions. The prosecutor's office participating at $1.5 million. The budget for the sheriff's office was reduced slightly by one position, and then we do anticipate additional revenue in the sheriff's office resulting from the possible outsourcing of food service and medical services in the jail. For development, this is the Department of Development, the Department of Sustainability, and Regional Collaboration. In 2018, we are projecting an increase in expenses up to about $4.1 million and staying largely the same in 2019. There was an additional investment in this program in the current biennium budget. This is new staffing, contracts related to outsourcing, the loan servicing in the Department of Development, and then some additional increases for staff training. The social services line is only the Veteran Services Commission. Their budget is set by ORC, so we have made no change to that. Health and safety is Public Safety and Justice Service. This is the program for CCOMs and emergency management. There was a targeted reduction applied to this budget of $150,000. This is the cash matches that the county provides for public safety grants. We've had $150,000 in the budget for the last several years that had gone largely unspent. It used to be for cash matches for firefighter grants. That was changed in 2017 to switch it from specific to firefighters to public safety in general. In 2017, the money was allocated, but we're projecting to decrease that in 2018 and 2019. The miscellaneous budget, the largest single expenditure in this budget is a subsidy to the capital improvements plan that I'll talk about a little bit later. There is a cut to the CIP. It was originally targeted or estimated at $15.2 million, and then we ended up backing off about $8 million. This was largely based on the ability of the department to get the work done within a current period. So the 15.2 million funds all of the projects on the 2018 CIP through their life, but they're not all going to be completed in 2018. So what we're doing is really just right-sizing the budget to only appropriate what we think is going to be spent in the current year. We've also included an allocation in this line of about $3 million to address pay equity issues for non-bargaining staff working under the authority of the county executive. That's 2018 and 19, and 19 is inflated by the 2%. And the last line is the subsidies to other county funds. We had a handful of reductions to these. The largest one was the demolition fund that we've already talked about. That was $8 million in 2018. We've also backed off $500,000 of the subsidy to the Planning Commission from the general fund, and we're proposing to supplant that with road and bridge dollars. So they would maintain their $1.3 million subsidy, but we're using two different funding sources for that. And then in 2018, we are not assuming a subsidy to the Economic Development Fund, originally estimated at $5.5 million, but we are projecting that that's going to come back in the budget in 2019 at $4 million.
And what's the ASH subsidy?
Animal shelter, sorry.
Animal shelter, okay.
That's about $270,000 a year.
Okay.
Originally, it was slated to be cut.
Okay.
Any questions?
Okay. Yes. Ms. Brown?
Thank you. With regards to the public safety grant, she said that, are we eliminating that or just reducing it?
Eliminating.
Okay. And then you did say that there were funds allocated in this year. Can you speak to that? How much of the 150 was used?
I believe 100% of it was, would you know? For the public safety grants? I think it was 100%. I can get back to you, but I'm pretty sure it was all allocated this year.
Okay, thank you.
It had never been spent in prior years.
Well, I'm not surprised when you changed it from the firefighter to public safety, that broadened the opportunity for applicants. So I'm guessing for the municipalities. And so was it multiple municipalities or was
Yes.
it? Wow,
Yes.
okay, all right.
I do want to point out, and Brandy Carney can talk about this too, I think she left, but this is not the only opportunity that the county provides to help the municipalities with grants, particularly in the area of emergency management and homeland security. So the department receives millions of dollars in federal and state money that they pass on to the cities. This was the only general fund allocation. So it's not that we're eliminating this service to the cities in its entirety. Any other questions about the general fund? Okay. So the next one briefly is just talking about the 0.25% fund. This is a fund that captures the activity associated with the additional sales tax that was levied in 2007 by the Board of County Commissioners. The 2018 and 2019 budgets for this fund are balanced. We are projecting about $58 million in revenue in 2018, $58 million in expenses in 2018, and then $56 million in 2019. The decrease between 2018 and 19 is that $2 million that we're expecting to be reimbursed from the Road and Bridge Fund in 2018. Other than that, these expenses are largely constant. The primary expenses that come out of this fund are debt service for the Medical Martin Convention Center, the county's hotel, and the Q project. There are no operating expenses here.
What accounts for the reduction from 2017 to 2018 from 77 to 58 million?
So in 2017, we have some one-time revenue that we're projecting. There's a transfer of $10 million from the CCCFDC, that's the capital reserve for the convention center, that we expect to be transferred to the county, maintained as a reserve fund, but those funds are county funds, so they should be in the county budget. And then we are also projecting a transfer of, I believe it was $16 million from the debt service fund for the Rock Hall. That was excess cash that we moved in here. There's more information about that in the second quarter report too. But those were both one-time revenue sources. The increase from in 2018 is largely just reflecting transfers. So like I mentioned, we are increasing the transfer from this fund to the general fund from 5.5 million to 7.5 million. So that's why the expenses go from 55 million to 58 million, is we have to budget transfers as if they were expenses.
And are there any expenditures for the Q project that come out of this fund, and where are they in here?
Yes, so all of the county's direct expenses that are going to be Q-related are coming out of here. The largest ones are actually in 2017. So in 2017, the county's responsible for the 2016 and 2017 contributions that total about $5.4 million. And then the annual contribution from the 0.25% fund is $1.5 million. It does fluctuate through the life of the bond deal, but I don't think it goes higher than $2 million in any year. And there is no obligation from this fund after the tax sunsets, or the sales tax sunsets. Any questions about the 0.25% fund? Okay. So on to the Health and Human Services Levy Fund. I will start by reminding everybody that one of our levies is up for renewal in 2018, so hopefully we'll see that on the ballot in March 2018. That levy is worth about $103 million to the county. For 2018 and 2019, we are maintaining property tax estimates equal to what we're expecting in 2017, which is about $232 million. As I mentioned earlier, the 2019 estimates might change as a result of the sexennial appraisal next year, but it's too early for me to change the estimates yet. So we're holding firm at $232 million. For expenses, we're only expecting a slight increase in 2018 and 2019. We have a surplus in 2017. So we are just barely balanced in this fund, but we are balanced. Both 18 and 19 are reliant on a drawdown on PA fund reserves of about $11 million each year. An additional $3 million will be drawn down in 2020, and at the end of 2020, we're projecting only about $1 million in the PA fund.
So it's balanced in a technical sense because the revenues exceed expenditures, but it's not balanced in a structural sense because significant amounts of PA dollars were used. Is that correct?
That's correct. In 2020, we'll have to make either additional cuts or identify additional revenue if we want to maintain this level of spending. The next slide just shows the levy revenue going back actually to 2004 and some information on the last few levies that we've had on the ballot. The most important thing, of course, is that the levy, we have the smaller one is on the ballot in 2018. And like I said, that's worth about $103 million to the county. Any questions about the levies? So just before the executive touched on this, but I do want to be clear that when we present the schedules for council for the budget, which you'll have soon, all told, we're cut about $7 million from the levies in order to balance the fund for 2018 and 2019. As he mentioned, this is based on historical underspends, and I can answer questions about that too if you have any additional questions, but largely we have been reluctant, obviously, to budget to the penny in the levy fund because we don't want there to be an instance where we have a client come for services and we're struggling to appropriate dollars or figure out how to serve them. But the fact remains that we have been over budgeting based on our capacity to serve, based on the service demand for whatever particular service we're talking about. This budget right sizes, similar to what I was saying with the capital projects, it's just based on what we actually think is going to be spent in a current year. And that's what the $7 million reduction is. But we do have a reserve on balance, so this is the lovingly referred to as below the line, that we're going to put in the levy funds so that the funds are there, are ready to be drawn on if needed. If it comes to that we have a child who wants UPK, we're going to serve them, and we will draw on the reserves as needed. Even if we draw down the full $7 million, which I don't anticipate will happen, but if we do, we will still be above the 10% mandated minimum cash balance in the levy fund. Questions about that?
Yes. Ms. Conwell.
Through the chair to Maggie, you kind of lost me a little bit. So you're saying that we have $7 million in reserve of extra levy fund dollars that have not been utilized, and we're gonna draw down that, add it into the budget, and then also put money into the reserve in case we need it.
No, sorry, let me
Okay,
try this again.
okay.
So in the levy reserves, we have about $40 million in the levy reserves. And we have a budget now that's 231 revenue, 231 expenses. That budget assumes that we can do what we need to do for the people who come to us for help without spending this additional $7 million. So we are making assumptions in this budget based on the requests we're going to get for service, based on changing operations in our own internal departments that Tom Pristower, David Merriman, somebody will talk about, that we're changing how we do things so that we hope we can still serve the same number of people without spending more dollars. But we are recognizing that this is a reduction, that we have mandates, so we're putting a reserve on balance, which will just reflect that we are willing to spend the dollars if it comes to that. So we're not going to be denying services to anyone. Number of kids in care is up. I think we're at 1934 today, so that's higher than we've ever been. But we just are not programming the dollars in the budget yet because we don't think that they'll be spent.
Okay.
If we have to spend them, we will have to come to council for appropriation.
And where would that money come from at that point?
That will come from the $40 million from the true reserves in the levy fund. But right now, we're at about an 19% cash balance. So even if we draw down the 7 million, we'll still be above 10%. And we're required by county code to be above 10%.
So we've always, every year, put in about 7 million as a reserve.
No, we have never done this before. Actually, what
Okay.
we've done in the past is we actually budget for it.
Gotcha.
So what happens is every year, well, for at least the last 2 years, is I come up here every quarter and say, we've got these large surpluses in our levy-funded agencies because they
usually-
just can't spend to the level that we've been budgeting.
And then we usually put that back at the end of the year, back
Mm-hmm.
to the levy reserves, correct?
And I anticipate that we'll be doing the same thing next year.
Okay. so
We're just
when-
not budgeting it anymore.
Gotcha. So when was the last time that we actually had to dip into those reserves for, in terms of, like you just suggested, that if we have a UPK or we having a,
So we have, to my knowledge, at least in the last 2 years that I've been back here, we haven't been doing that because we have been, what I would say is over budgeting
Budgeting.
the departments. So we give them this pad.
Okay.
And I certainly understand why we've done that, but what we do then is that we carry these surpluses all year. So in order to not have to make deeper cuts
Gotcha.
and actually turn off a service, this is how we're proposing to do this. So hopefully this will mean preserving services.
okay, so this will just be in this 2-year budget cycle right now, and then we plan on going back to the not budgeting?
Well, I think we have to, with the caveat that we'll see where we are in 2020. I think we'll have other things to talk about in 2020 in the levy fund. But, you know, if I'm still standing here, I would not recommend going back to how we did it before. I'm very concerned or reluctant to over budget in areas because I think we are potentially denying something else. So I don't want to say we're going to spend $100 million here and not spend 10 million here if we're actually going to spend 90 here. Because then I have this surplus, the county has this surplus. We're getting down to the wire here, obviously, that we don't have huge surpluses left, but the reserve would be a draw on, the cash balance in the fund. But if we had to budget appropriately, I think we would be cutting off a non-mandated service that either keeps the cost of our mandates down, so we should be doing it anyway, or is critically important to the community.
Gotcha, thank you.
Is the sub-reserve, is it 7 million one time or 7 million in each of 18 and 19?
It's going to be in both years. Don't quote me on the 7 million. It's 7 million and change, but it'll be in both
Sure.
years.
And if some of that money needed to be accessed, would that be done by including an item in a bi-monthly fiscal resolution?
It would be. And we'll know well ahead of time because we're doing projections on a monthly basis. Trevor has asked me to update council when I do my updates every month to provide updates, particularly on the health and human service cuts and how we're faring with our operational changes. So we will know well in advance if we're going to need to appropriate additional dollars. and it would be done on a fiscal agenda.
Okay, fine. Anything else at this time? Okay, all funds?
Okay. So on an all funds basis, again, this is, as the name suggests, all of the county funds. This does not include capital projects, does not include grants. That will be changing when we implement the ERP, but as it stands right now, this is just the operating budget. For 2018 and 2019, we're looking at about 1.5 billion. This is consistent with where we've been in the past couple of years. The individual funds fluctuate quite a bit, but in total, we have not changed for several years, actually. As the executive mentioned, we are maintaining the $39 million subsidy to the Adams Board. This is to address behavioral health care, specifically the opiate epidemic. This includes the establishment of a housing fund. The housing fund is usually the cash balance in one of our development funds. That's $1 million in 2018, $2 million in 2019 and 2020. This assumes the transfer of $6.5 million in casino tax revenue to the Economic Development Fund in both years. And I just want to point out that it's not fully budgeted yet, but this budget will be reflecting a draw on the cash balance in the Court of Common Pleas's computerization fund. They are planning a computer refresh that will purchase new computers for the court, the clerk of courts, and domestic relations court. We're getting estimates for that right now. That's why it's not reflected in the numbers, but this will largely deplete their fund. Questions?
Yes.
Thank you.
Vice President.
Thank you. Maggie, the housing fund, help me with the terminology. Is this the housing fund that we were just talking about,
Yes.
the 3 million? This 1 million, 2 million, is it coming from the demolition dollars, or is it coming from, help me to understand.
So we're using a cash balance in one of development's revolving loan funds. The development department has 2 revolving loan funds, well, 3, I guess technically. One is the Economic Development Fund, one is the Development Revolving Loan Fund, and they have a Brownfield Revolving Loan Fund. The Development Revolving Loan Fund has a cash balance of about $5 million, and the funds aren't used. The only expenses in this fund for the last several years has been a transfer from the Development Revolving Loan Fund to the Brownfield Revolving Loan Fund so that we can give out grants and loans for mostly Phase 1 and Phase 2 assessments for Brownfield remediation. We are going to be using that cash balance to support this housing fund.
And again, this is the housing fund that's going to do the foreclosure prevention. And what is the total amount going into the housing fund? Is it 3 million?
It's $3 million over the biennium, and we're assuming, at least for right now, that it'll continue in 2020.
1.5 the first year, 1.5
$1 million the first year, and then $2 million the second year.
second year. Okay. What are the total dollar amounts that the casino tax revenue generates?
Casino generates about $7.5 million a year.
And this is 6.5 for the ED fund?
Correct. We have been transferring $4 million for the last 2 years from the Economic Development Fund. So this budget proposes to increase that by $1.5 million.
Okay. And one more question.
I think so.
And I apologize, but I'm going back, it's on the development fund. We have the development in the general operating fund. We have monies going to loan servicing. There's an independent company that's providing these loan services. And I assume that means capturing some of those unpaid loans we've had over the past. Do we have a dollar amount as to what the unpaid dollar amount of, how much unpaid loans are so far in arrears?
We do have that. I don't have it off the top of my head. Do you know? 8, 9 million? It's about $9 million.
$9 million.
So we have not anticipated, just to be clear, in the budget, we're not anticipating increases from this because there's just no way to estimate how much of that $9 million is collectible. I don't know how many of those businesses are still in business. So we monitor everything monthly, but this is one of the things that we'll monitor monthly and update our estimates as needed. The Economic Development Fund has been bringing in about $1.5 million every year, so anything above that they can bring in obviously would be wonderful, and we can use those dollars to enhance our economic development plan. But we're not anticipating that right now. I'm sorry.
Along that line, the Economic Development Director estimated to us that not figuring for past collections, if all the loans just made good on current expected repayments, we're looking at 4.3 million for 2017, which would be a significantly higher number than the director just mentioned, 1.5. So it would be a significantly higher number than we've seen in the past.
How far back did you go in terms of?
This only assumed that that loans that are in good standing made good on them, and we're not talking about collecting back due amounts that are in arrears. If everyone that has current loans in place makes regularly scheduled payments, we're talking about 4.3. So that would be a larger number than we've been seeing.
You're speaking to the current loans.
Right, we're
newly
talking
created
about
pretty much
current
under our
loans.
Western Reserve Fund.
Is that a reasonable number, or are you skeptical of that number?
No, I'm not. If my staff are saying that's true, then that's true.
Okay, fine. Okay.
Hey, thank you, Maggie.
Okay.
Any other questions? How do you make this go back? Oh, thank you. Sorry, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the capital improvements plan. As part of the budget process, the county submits a 5-year capital plan to council for approval. The capital plan is largely facilities and the airport. What we have here is 2017, 18, and 19. The Department of Public Works is finalizing its plan. We have the full 5-year plan, but we're focusing on 18 and 19 at this point. As I had mentioned earlier, we did have a targeted reduction to the budget for the CIP. So the CIP is funded by some outside sources, including like reimbursement from the Federal Aviation Administration, public assistance funds, but the majority of the funding comes from the general fund. We had originally estimated $15.2 million, and we're cutting that back to $7.2 million in 2018 and 2019. The plan that the department has submitted, which we will forward to you, includes a number of projects. If you have questions about the specific projects, I would ask that you would defer those to the Public Works Director, because I probably can't answer them. But there are a handful of projects on there totaling about $3 million that are Justice Center related, that I just want to point out may or may not have to take place depending on the conversation with the Justice Center. So there are going to be some changes to this plan that take place all year long. And we bring the plan back to council every time either a project changes or the estimates change, so that council's aware of that. For 2018 and 2019, they are budgeting for projects in excess of what the budgeted amount is from the general fund. This is so that they have projects already in the works, and they're prepared if we have projects that come in under budget, that they can do other things, and we're not sitting around waiting for projects to do because everything came in under budget. Usually these projects do come in under budget. Public Works is conservative, rightfully so, in their estimates, so we probably will see a little bit more taking place in terms of the number of projects than what's going to be presented as part of the budget package. But the department is aware that they only have the $7.2 million available to them over the 2 years, and I don't expect that there'll be any issues as it relates to going over budget. Do you have any questions on the CIP?
I would just point out to everybody that the continuous monitoring and reporting on the capital improvements plan is something that came out of the council when we passed legislation to set up a continuous reporting system. Prior to that, it came to us only with the budget, but was not seen otherwise. So it's a useful tool, and we appreciate your assistance with it. Could you explain, for example, for 2018 projects, we have 31 million in total and 8.1 in general fund impact. What accounts for the rest, the part that's not general fund impact? Where does that money come from?
So a number of different sources. Some of them are, we've had projects on this plan that use some road and bridge and sewer dollars. They get federal money, they get grant dollars, a lot of grant dollars actually that go toward the capital projects. There is some public assistance dollars. I don't mean PA fund reserves, but just largely the Health and Human Services agencies pay for some of the projects. We're doing a couple projects at the Virgil Brown building in 2018. So there's a number of different funding sources.
And again, looking at 2018, the general fund allocation amount is 8,187,000, and the general fund CIP contribution is 7.2 million. So where does the other approximately 1 million come from?
So if all of the projects cost what we think they're going to cost today, we're not going to do that additional $1 million in projects. The department can probably better explain this than I'm doing right now, but what they're saying is, since usually the projects come in less than what we're budgeting, they want to make sure that we don't have $1 million and we're not going to spend it, because there are projects that we can do if we have the money. So they are programming 10 projects, they're doing some design work, they're doing some due diligence. Maybe we'll only get 9 of them done this year, but based on how usually the projects come in, we'll probably get all 10 done because they tend to overestimate.
Okay, fine. Other questions on the capital improvements plan? I consider this a very important part of the budget that should get more study and attention than it usually gets. It's a very important part of what we do. I would now open to questions from anybody on anything that we've heard today.
Well, I have debt still.
Oh, you have debt. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Please cover the debt.
And I want to be clear also, this is obviously an overview in every sense of the word.
We know that.
Okay, so when
Yeah.
you get the budget submission though, you will have the full 5-year plan for the capital project. So you'll see every plan, what we're expecting it to cost, and then timeline for completion.
So far, we have about 3-inch high grass. We're going to have 3 or 4 foot weeds before we get done with this.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so debt. As of January 1st, 2018, the county has about $1.1 billion in outstanding debt. I do want to be clear that debt is kind of a negative connotation to that term. For us, it's not a bad thing that we have this debt. This enables us to do what we need to do and still maintain funding for our mandated programs and services. And our debt burden is less than that of the other urban counties. So I've pulled around in terms of general fund and all funds, we are less than the other counties. We have a total of 22 issues. 4 of them are general obligation. Those are largely paid with property tax dollars. 13 are revenue bonds. 4 are sales tax, and we have 1 certificates of participation, which is the county hotel. We have 1 issue that's maturing next year. That's the Rock Hall. It's a general obligation bond. That has already been fully funded, so you will see no change in the budget since that's maturing. And then we have 3 issues that mature within the next 5 years. One of the medical mart issues, another general obligation. This is the one I had mentioned earlier that we do have one coming off, so you'll see a $5 million increase in property tax revenue when that various purpose bond matures. And then we have the original Gateway debt issue, which is going to mature in 2020. The next slide just shows our obligation for 2018 and 19 by issue type. Though I have nothing here for the general obligations in terms of the general fund obligation, as I said before, I do want to be clear that these are property tax dollars that are owed to the county that we divert into the debt service fund. So if we didn't have the general obligation debt, we will receive more in our share of property tax dollars. So we the world does look better for us in terms of property tax collection in 2020 and especially in 2021 because we will be seeing a couple of our debts mature. We did make some changes in this budget relative to debt service. One is that we issued debt for the Western Reserve Fund, which is now the Economic Development Fund. That debt service is about $784,000 a year. We had been paying for that out of the county's general fund. We switched that payment to the Economic Development Fund itself. And then also, it came to my attention only in the last month or two that the county has the option to direct the trustees who hold all of our cash for the debt portfolio on how the funds are invested. We have not been exercising that authority, and we did a couple of quick analyses on just a few of our issues, and it turns out we are leaving money on the table. So effective now, we have asked our investment manager to take over investing of the debt portfolio, and we do anticipate that this is going to bring in about $400,000 a year in additional interest income. Additional interest income means the general fund has to kick in less for debt service. So what you'll see when you get the schedules is I just took down the payments of one of our debt issues. I have no idea which one is going to generate the money. So just to capture the savings in the general fund, I took it off one of the commercial redevelopment debt issue. But that hopefully is going to be a major change and a positive one for the county. And that's it. Now I'll
Okay.
take questions on anything.
So, our total obligation in 2018 is 111 million, which is almost exactly 10% of the outstanding debt of 1.1 billion. Of that 111 million, can you give me a ballpark on how much of that is principal and how much of that is interest?
The outstanding obligation is just principal.
So how is the interest paid?
We are paying the interest, but this only reflects the principal.
So, this 2018 obligation, that's
That-
how much we pay this year, is that right?
The 2018 obligation is the outstanding principal. Oh, no, I'm sorry, you're right, it is principal and interest. The 1.1 billion is just the principal. This is principal and interest.
And do you have any idea of how it splits up between how much of it is principal and how much of it
Most
is?
of it's interest, because a large share of the debt service is still for the hotel and the medical mart, and it's mostly interest so
Mostly
far.
interest, that's- yeah.
The hotel, I think, is all interest.
Okay.
One thing on this, though, just for the revenue bonds, we have other revenue sources that contribute to the debt service on these revenue bonds. So, and it's hard to estimate how much money we'll bring in. One of them is, like I said, the original gateway issue that was in 1992. We do use admissions tax revenue that funds the debt service. So as that revenue increases, the county's obligation decreases. That's why we see some variance between what we budget for debt service and what we actually end up paying. So the obligations that's reflected here is assuming that we're going to have to pay everything, because that is the county's obligation. But there will be other revenue that comes in, and you'll see that what we're budgeting for debt service is much less than the 65 million.
Okay. We're open for questions on any subject, and we'll go to Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was just about the comparison. You said that we are less than other urban counties. When you say other urban counties, is that just in Ohio or nationally?
Ohio.
Okay, so when can you just give me a comparison, like Hamilton, Franklin, something like what are we using as a measuring stick?
For the debt specifically, so I just looked at them and asked, what is your debt burden? Like, what % of your general fund do you spend on debt?
Right,
And
so
they
which
are higher
counties?
So I always look at Franklin, Hamilton, Lucas, and Montgomery.
Thank you.
The 5 of us email like every day.
Franklin, Hamilton,
And I can
Lucas.
get that for you, and Montgomery.
Okay,
I can get that for you if you want.
thank you.
Send that to Trevor and have him send it out to everybody.
Okay.
Okay. Jones? and
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Council President and Nan.
Maggie, I know you just touched on it, but clarify for me again, how much of the principal and the interest, is it all captured on, in the numbers we see here?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
The 1.1 billion represents principal and interest. The January 1, 2018, the county has 1.1 billion in outstanding debt.
So the next page, the 2018 and 2019 obligations, that's principal and interest. The 1.1 billion is just outstanding principal.
Outstanding principal. Okay, so 111 million in 2018, and then 114 million in 2019.
That's how much we have to pay in that year in principal and interest on the $1.1 billion debt.
On the 1.1 billion. Okay. Okay. Clarification on certificates of participation. Well, let me ask my question this way. This is the perspective where I'm coming from. I'm looking at the debt, and I'm trying to characterize what the debt means. For me, I look at debt as like if I have a credit card, that's debt I've already had in my fund, and I've got to pay it back. But then there's ones where I have revenue. Say if I rent out a limousine, I
Yes.
owe it, but I'm making money off of it. So I'm characterizing the debt in that way. I look at the revenue, and I'm not too concerned.
Right.
Help me to understand, general obligation for me is the other one. But the certificate of participation, help me to understand
So
what
the
that is.
certificate, this is exclusively for the hotel. And there is revenue that comes into this to offset the debt service. So the county does receive, we're projecting it to be 8 million this year and actually 8 million next year too. Well, for all 3 years, from the Hilton that will go toward debt service. So there is some revenue that contributes to that.
Okay,
It's, the annual debt service, at least for the next 3 years, is about $20 million for the hotel, and then 8 of it will come from Hilton, hopefully.
okay.
If everyone else is having their fun.
So, right.
And that's the case for most, now the general obligation, now that the rock hall's done, we have very little revenue that's coming in to support those. There are 2 special assessments that we get money from other cities that are contributing, but largely that would otherwise be general fund dollars. For the revenue bonds, there are other revenue sources coming into those. So for example, we have the Westin Hotel, Steelyard Commons. There are TIFs on those properties. The TIFs fully fund debt service. So I have here that we are obligated to pay, but we're not going to pay anything for either of those issues this year. The original Gateway, the annual debt service on that, I think, is $4.7 or $8 million. We're probably only going to pay 1.7 next year because there's other revenue sources coming in.
Okay.
The sales tax, those ones, no. I mean, those are coming directly from our sales tax. This does include the Q project. Now, there are obviously other revenue sources contributing there. The general fund's not going to pick up anything for the Q probably until 2020, except for our 0.25% contribution. But anything else from the general fund, there will be other revenue sources that feed into that first.
Okay, so the sales tax debt of $12 million, $12.5 million in 2018, this is part of the, you said, who did you say this was, what made this 12.8?
So we have a 2014 issue, that's the largest one. We had an issue from 2014 that was $137 million. The ERP was part of that issue. It's also capital projects, but that's how we're funding the ERP is from the 2014 issue. So that's the big one. And then we have the public square debt that was issued in at the end of 2015. That's paid for by a TIF, so we don't really have to worry about that one. But the
That
sales.
could increase sales tax, couldn't it?
What's that?
On the
Right,
public square. could
and
help with
and that's why
sales
we're
tax.
assuming that since their property values has increased,
Right.
the increase in the property values is paying off debt
Yeah.
service. So we don't worry about that one because everyone loves
The
that.
ERP will not increase sales tax.
No,
Right.
it will not.
Right, so,
And so that is coming, and I factor that into the budget. So this year, the sales tax debt service is significantly less, actually. It's about 1-point-something million or 2 million, and it's bumping up to 6 next year. But that is factored into our numbers.
so what invariably happens is that the media will say you got $1.1 billion in debt and you can't spend, you can't do this. characterize for me the overall debt. How much of it, and maybe a percentage, to describe the health of our debt situation? Would you say more than half of it has a revenue source, it increases sales tax, or is it debt? Like
Well, it all has a revenue source.
all, yes.
So
but-
it's not, some of it's local, so some of it is ours, that's true, the sales tax. The sales tax, like I said, this is, except for the public square deal, this is all coming out. So we will pay $6.5 million next year in sales tax. That also does include the 2016 issue for the Huntington Park garage. We're gonna get reimbursed from the garage fund for that, so that's about $1.5 million. But the rest of that's coming off of the sales tax. But in terms of how, to answer, like, you can't afford all the debt you have, for the general fund, we pay, don't quote me on these numbers because I'm looking at a draft schedule, but about $50 million in debt service, which includes the medical mart, which is expensive, and includes the hotel, which is expensive. And our general fund budget is $425 million, $450 million.
So, Director,
So it's
you're-
50 out of that.
you're saying the obligation listed here is 65.9 million, but you're estimating that we're actually gonna have to pay roughly 50, is that correct?
Probably. Like I said, don't quote me on the numbers, but in 2017, we're only paying 47 million. And our obligation is not much less in 17 than it is in 18, except for the sales tax one.
Okay, ballpark is 50,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Council President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Maggie, I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. I'd like to try to understand this sub-reserve for Health and Human Services a little better, because I'm finding a little, I feel like I need to understand that better.
Okay. So I don't know how, it probably would help if you could see the schedules, but so what we're doing in the levy fund is we have 232 million that we're expecting to bring in, and we're expecting to pay out 232 million. That's the best case. That's what we assume is going to happen based on a number of assumptions that we're making in this budget. All we're saying is that we are going to put a reserve on balance. So on our schedules, we calculate the cash balance after beginning cash, then revenue, less expenses, and then we have our ending cash balance. Then we do reserves on balance, which can be for any number of things. We're going to put a reserve on balance of $7 million, and then we calculate our available cash balance, which will always be less than the unadjusted cash balance. It's
So you're
all
go-
it is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's just a recognition that we know we have needs, we know we're making assumptions in this budget, we know we're going to be trying something different in Health and Human Services. If it doesn't hold true, the executive is fully prepared to come to council and ask to appropriate the $7 million, effectively restoring all of the cuts that we made in HHS. So he will draw on the reserves, we'll have an unbalanced budget to do what we need to do for 2018.
Okay, Maggie, so we're going to draw down on the Health and Human Reserve to create a reserve.
We're actually not going to draw anything. It's on paper.
Oh, it's just on
We're,
paper.
we're not going to transfer the cash.
So we're just calling it a sub-reserve.
Don't call it a sub-reserve.
Okay, well,
It's-
tell me what to call it.
Call it a reserve on balance.
Okay.
But we're not
Whatever you
taking the
say.
cash. We're not creating a new fund. That's more work than anybody needs to
So
do.
let's
It's
just
just a
assume it's just
recognition.
money still in the Health and Human Reserve
absolutely.
Fund, right? Okay,
Yes.
that'd be easier for me.
Yes, it's just it literally is just kind of a recognition that we know if we have to spend this, we're willing to spend it.
And so let's say we need to spend it. Could you give me an example of what that would be? Or if you can't give me an
Sure.
example, that would be fine.
No, sure. So some of the cuts that we've made in Health and Human Services, one of the largest is to personnel. So we're projecting a total of about $4.5 million decrease in personnel. That's salaries and benefits. It's a nominal cut in terms of the total personnel costs for these agencies. So the largest three, obviously, Children and Family, Job and Family, and Senior and Adult Services. But it's not an insignificant amount of money, $4.5 million. We are assuming that we can reduce overtime. It's largely overtime. JFS alone spends about $6 million a year in overtime. The director is confident, the interim director and the director, they're all confident that we can reduce overtime. If we can't, and we end up spending the 4.5 million in personnel, that would be one of the cuts that we might have to restore, because we're not gonna lay people off so that we can maintain the budget.
All right, Maggie, so, Mr. Chairman, so, because we traditionally don't spend down every penny that we appropriate in these areas, we're going to budget it appropriately. I mean, that would be the way you're looking at
Yes.
at the budget. So what is the, just bear with me here, what's the difference between us appropriating the money and not spending it if we don't need to spend it, and not appropriating it and spending it if we need to spend it?
The difference is having a balanced budget and a budget that's structurally not balanced. So the one that we're presenting is balanced current revenue to current expenses. In the other, not your proposal, but if we were to budget it, we would have a budget that total resources exceeds expenses, but current revenue doesn't exceed expenses.
All right. I'm not familiar with this sort of approach, but could you give me, an example of where you've seen this done before?
We do this actually in the general fund. So we have a reserve every year for one of our outstanding debt issues, for the Flats project, that we have a reserve because we think we know that we won't pay it. So we put it as a reserve on balance instead of budgeting for it, because same reason, I don't want to tell Mike O'Malley, go cut $1.5 million if I know I'm not going to spend this $1.2 million that we put on reserve every year. Similarly, we have a reserve for our carryover obligations. So we expect, if we have contracts this year totaling $10 million, we're only going to spend $5 million this year. The other $5 million is a reserve on balance. So we assume that it might come out of the cash balance next year. So we've never done this in the levies. But we have, again, only speaking for my time in OBM, we have been much stricter is probably the bad word for this, but we've been more strict in our general fund spending than in the levies. We've all been much more reluctant to budget down to the penny in the levies, myself included, like I said, because we don't want to be in a position where Children and Family Services has to come and ask for more money because we have kids that need to be served.
Right.
So we've had these huge surpluses, but with this particular budget, when faced with either pad Children and Family Services budget and know they're going to not spend the and I'm calling out Children and Family Services only because they're the largest, not because they always have the surplus, but I know they're not going to spend it, and then I have to tell somebody else to cut, and that's a real cut. So we're just trying to avoid real cuts to services to have a surplus.
Well, just a short follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Would you remind me about what we have in the Health and Human Service Reserve and what percentage that amounts to, accounts for, and also with the general fund reserve as well?
Sure. So in the levy fund first, let me pull out second quarter since that one was published. So these numbers will change slightly when you see the budget submission, but as of second quarter, we were projecting in 2017 to have an ending cash balance in the levy fund of about $40 million. That is 17% of total expenses.
And the council, although it's arbitrary because the council can change it, we have a limit of about 10%. Is that that's been practiced? Even though we've been way over that,
right?
That's been our red line in the sand for quite a while.
Right, and that's county code, so just as you're saying, you can change that. If we fall below the 10%, the code does require that we submit a plan to get back above the 10%, or you'd have to change the minimum. But that's correct. But we've always been over in the levy fund.
But we could change the minimum.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And how about the general?
So for the general fund, Again, this is as of second quarter, so the numbers will change slightly when you see the actual budget documents. But general fund now, general operating plus 0.25%, because that's what the general fund is. We're projecting to have an ending cash balance in 2017 of $156 million. That's 34% cash balance. Hold on. I see where you're going with this. So there's a sizable cash balance in the 0.25% fund. We have a large buildup of cash there. In the general operating fund, we were projecting to end the year with a cash balance of $108 million, which is 27% of expenses.
27%, and we've had a 25%.
That's code 2.
That's also where we've put ourselves.
Right. Now, the code requirement, the county code requirement is general fund, so general operating plus 0.25%. So we have to be at 25, and as of mid-year, we were assuming we would be at 34. Best practice, so separate from the code, is 20 to 25%. So regardless of what we do, if you end up changing the code requirements, I will never not stand up here and say you should have anything less than 20% in the general operating fund.
You will never stand up there
I
and
will
say
never
will
say that you should have
never
less than
be
20%.
Less than 20%, which
Never.
is 5% below what our level is now.
That's correct.
Okay, and just to be clear about this, and I don't want to suggest that we're rating the general fund reserve, but what is, do you know, I mean, or does someone else know what the general fund reserve is in, say, Franklin County, another very large county? I know it's apples and oranges to a certain extent, but
Franklin County is like apples to cars, because they have, last I checked, they had a cash balance of like 56% or 60%. They have so much, I don't know how, but they have so much cash in Franklin County. For the other counties, we are higher. So I can do another poll, because the last time I checked was toward the beginning of the year, but most of the other counties are around 15%.
well, they have a lot more people in
Franklin?
County now, right?
Not a lot more.
Oh, I guess
They
the whole
just
thing,
barely
the whole
beat
thing
us.
is the city of Cleveland, the city of Columbus at this
Right,
point,
right.
practically, right?
Yeah, they are
what
larger
is-
than us,
So
for
what
sure.
is their, what is their percentage? What is their red line? Do they have a red line?
No, so no other urban county has anything that's code. They all have policies, but most of them are, we like to be at 15 to 20%. Most of them are below.
Below, where would you say most of them are, including Franklin County? It's so healthy.
So most of them are around 15%.
Around 15%.
They try to get
So
for 20,
10
just like us.
More than 10% below where we are.
That's correct.
And,
Except for Franklin, which is this ridiculous outlier.
Okay. All right, well, I just
Sorry if
wanted
anyone lives in
to
Franklin.
clarify that. That's
Yeah,
what I thought.
I can get that
I
to
thought
you,
that
though.
was the case. And so I just want to put things in perspective, so thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your overview. It's my first budget here, so I'm listening more than asking. If I can just ask a couple of maybe bigger picture questions and then get into the weeds, perhaps a little later. The debt is in front of me now, so I'll ask that question first. The 1.1 billion is principal only. Can you tell me what it is if you include the interest?
Not off the top of my head, but I can get that for you.
Okay. Secondly, I guess, in just the bigger picture question, given the MCO funds that that has been diminished for this proposal and for years ahead, but just what we're looking for now in this budget, where would you say we have really been compromised because of the MCO funds? It seems that we have been able to find, a lot of creative type of revenue. Let me see here, whether it's 17 million for the, looks like the demo funds, and 3 million in some other, we can add all these up and we can probably get to 20, 30 million and so where would you say we need to work or be perhaps attentive to and I've heard prosecutor, the defender's office and perhaps some housing demolition. It looks like we've taken some hits there. But where would you say, in the big picture of this budget, where we have really been compromised in the dollars that we have lost through the MCO funds of about 25 million, I think, which we could get maybe 6 to 10 of that back?
Right. So, sorry, but my daughter is blowing up my phone, so I'm just
Oh.
gonna have her to, can you text my sister? I think she's locked out.
Oh.
No, she should have brought her key. No sympathy for her. Okay, so sorry. It's like the third time this week. So the hit is to the general fund, for sure. Because the sales tax is, it at least used to be, more than 60% of general fund revenue. So that's where we are taking the hit. Just kind of if you want to look at the general fund in total, by default, it would seem that the disproportionate burden would be in the area of public safety and justice services, because they combined represent about 75% of our general fund. That will include the county jail, which is our largest single spend. Now, the general fund, as the name suggests, we can allocate those dollars as we would like. So it's not that if you get a $25 million hit to the general fund, the public defender automatically gets dinged or the prosecutor gets dinged, but somebody has to get dinged because it's about 27 million, so that's how much we're down. We have tried to compensate for that best we can. We have some one-time revenue sources. We are hoping to generate some additional revenue through some of the regionalizing corrections, some of the other initiatives that we're taking, but it's not going to compensate for 27 million in 1 year for sure. So any general fund agency, as soon as we heard about the MCO, it was all the general fund agencies that we started looking at, kind of saying, okay, who's going to take the fall? So it's the general government programs, fiscal, IT, HR, law department, and then public safety and justice services. And they are the biggest user of general fund dollars because there just aren't that many other alternative funding sources to fund those programs and services.
So the dollars that were, I realize it's for just this budget, and you may not have those resources again.
Excuse me, Ms. Baker, can you turn on your microphone?
Thank you. You may not have those resources again, but just for the one-time money that we've been able to locate, of the $27 million, how much of that would you say we've been able to recover through, very carefully and examining, some, as you said earlier, some programs that we had left over funding, maybe overfunding, all these kind of different things that we've been able to cobble together in order to make up for the 27 million that.
So between revenue and expenses, we are covering it.
Okay.
So this budget is balanced. It assumes the complete loss of the MCO dollars, and we are we're still going to function. So we are assuming it's going to be 100% covered. That is a combination of the two, though. Okay. In terms of revenue, the largest increases in revenue are one time in 2018 and 2019. Okay. They have different one times in each year. We are assuming a 2% increase on sales tax, which is a couple million each year, but then for 2018 specifically, we have the 4.5 million in the unclaimed funds, 3 million from the rental registry, 3 million from old capital project accounts, 2 million from the 0.25% fund to when we get the reimbursement from the road and bridge fund. That's all one-time revenue.
Right.
So
4.5 million in unclaimed funds.
4.5 million, correct. Did I say something else?
No,
Oh.
you just didn't include that item.
Oh, sorry, okay. But so, the executive doesn't like to use one-time revenue. I don't love using one-time revenue, although it's present in every budget that we do.
Right.
But it buys us time to hopefully see that how can we operate under this new normal where we are $27 million
Right.
less every year.
So just to follow, so the challenge is not in this budget. The challenge is in 2020 and 2021 and years beyond?
Yeah, that's largely correct. I would respectfully disagree that we don't have a challenge in this budget, only because I think every agency that has agreed to their cuts, we have a few that haven't agreed to their cuts, so that will be your challenge. But even the ones that have, it's not easy for them. So we don't have any agencies, even in HHS, that were just sitting on millions of dollars and don't know how to spend it. In 2017, we had no problem spending the 27 million that we got in the MCO sales tax dollars. So I think there is going to be a challenge in 18 to get through the year, because a budget is just assumptions. It's a combination of assumptions, and we are making a lot of them as it relates to our own agencies, as it relates to the outside of elected officials. I have every confidence in the world that the prosecutor is going to be able to operate $1.5 million less. He's confident. When he's confident, I'm confident. But I can't guarantee that, because criminal caseloads are increasing, and it's, it's difficult for them. So I think there will be a challenge, but just in terms of looking at the numbers, yes, we are going to have a larger challenge in 2020 when some of these one-time revenues drop off. HHS is going to be a significant challenge in 2020, and then in 2021 we're going to have a problem because there's no more of the MCO transition payment. And we are assuming about $8.5 million of that in 2020. So already, you have an $8.5 million cut you'll have to make in 2021.
Right. Just one final, and to follow up on the reserve on balance, that 7 million that's set aside, and it's set aside so we don't include it so that we balance, where will that 7 million come from if we do need to use that 7 million or any part of it?
That will come from the levy reserves. So the cash balance in the levy fund, the 40 million.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Director, while you're talking about the 7 million, when you calculate the, whether we meet the 10% requirement, would that reserve on balance be subtracted from the balance in
Yes.
making that calculation?
So I calculate both ways when I do the presentations, which probably is annoying, but because the code is slightly ambiguous, which numbers we're supposed to be using. So I do calculate the unobligated cash balance and then the ones that consider the reserves. And either way, for the 7 million, we will be above the 10%, however you calculate it.
And on the 1/4% sales tax fund, which is part of the broader general fund, which is used to calculate the general fund reserve according to code. Am I correct that there are some things in that 25% fund that really probably shouldn't be considered as part of the reserve, like particularly the capital reserve, which is $10 million, if I remember correctly?
Yes. But, yes. So there is $10 million that I don't know how we're going to do this, whether we'll set up a separate sub-fund in the general fund for the $10 million or do a reserve on balance, but that money does, in your minds, need to be considered obligated. So you should not look at that $10 million and think spend. But
So what you're saying, so the 34% number, it's actually a little high.
it's a little high, by the $10 million.
Okay.
So in 2016, we had an ending cash balance of 26% in the general fund, which
Okay.
included both the general operating fund and the 1/4% fund. We had a lot of one-time expenses in 16 though, so
Okay.
that drove up the cost.
A couple other questions. Are we going to have the actual budget resolution in time for tonight's council meeting?
Yes.
Okay, good, because we want to get it substituted so that we have an actual resolution to work with.
Yes.
Also, regarding the Common Pleas Court, were we able to reach agreement with them, or are they one of the ones that we're going to have to work with over here?
No, we do have an agreement with the Court of Common Pleas. So they were one of the last ones that we reached an agreement with, which is not a reflection of anybody fighting back and forth. The court has worked with us every year that we've been doing budget cuts. So we started doing budget cuts in 2008 in the county, at least as long as I've been here, and the Court of Common Pleas has cut every year. So I think there's kind of a misnomer sometimes that the courts, we battle with the courts, and that's not the case with our Court of Common Pleas. We settled on a $3 million cut for the Court of Common Pleas. We had asked for 4, and we settled on 3.
Okay. Last call.
Mr. Chairman.
Council President followed by Vice President.
Well, thank you very much, Maggie, and this has been a good presentation. I appreciated it, and all the interaction leading up to this was really very helpful in getting to this point. As you know, we've got a long way to go. I'd just like to say to the council members that we are going to work very closely with the administration, but we have our own role to play. We have our own parameters to set in terms of what we decide is acceptable, and we will continue to work closely as we always have. The one of the questions I think is unanswered and that needs to be discussed is the broader question of the sustainability of health and human service issues. Although I see the word opioids in here and beside the Adams board, I don't really see information that would really give me the confidence that I need that money is really being, resources are really being allocated for this crisis that we referred to several times today. And I don't want to lay it all on that one issue. But I think that in order for us to get to the next levy opportunity after next year in 2022 is problematic, and that we can either do something about it or plan to do something about it now, or of course people will be doing something about it in a year or two, or at least, or more. So I just want to remind the council that our health and human service budgets is not sustainable with this budget as far as I'm concerned. It will get us a long way. I'm not recommending what we should do about it at this point. I'm just saying that we need to be thinking a few years ahead of this biennial budget in order to be sure that we can sustain the delivery of services in health and human services. Thank you.
Okay. Vice President Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maggie, I want to revisit the comment you made about the strategy for closing the gap in terms of, you described it as setting the budget when it came to overtime. I think it was HHS a little earlier, it's kind of fading, but in the terms of HHS, instead of budgeting what they would typically have, knowing they have overtime, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounded as if you said we would just budget without that in consideration, which led me to believe in the coming 2 years you might come back and ask for what's needed overtime when the time comes. Is that a fair assessment?
It's a possibility. It's not the plan. So you are correct. Part of the there's a $4.5 million cut to personnel in HHS. That is the largest single cut in HHS. And most of that is from overtime. So as I mentioned, JFS, it might even be more than 6.5 million these days, because I don't think I've looked at it recently, but last year they spent $6.5 million on overtime, which is only slightly less than what they work in the jail. And the department is confident that they can bring those numbers down without impacting wait times for Medicaid, food stamps. There were some large projects this year that required the staff to work additional overtime. They implemented a new case management system. They had a different, something with the Medicaid, I'm forgetting offhand because it's been 3 hours. But there were a couple of things there that the staff were just bombarded and they had to do their regular jobs as well. So overtime was through the roof. So they do think it can come down. In the base budget, we had anticipated that it would stay at that high level. So the plan is that we will not come back and ask for additional dollars. The plan is that we won't be spending the $7 million reserve on balance, but it's a possibility, absolutely.
Okay. So with that, and you mentioned it when you said the jail, has that strategy, and I haven't seen through all of the numbers, and we will get the numbers, but is that same strategy being implemented in the jails where they certainly have a significant amount of overtime as well? Maybe not as much as HHS, but it's
Oh, they
certainly.
do. The jail's the largest,
Just, that they're larger, okay.
absolutely.
Has that
So,
strategy been implemented in this area as well?
not in the same way. So the jail's a little bit different. Their overtime has gone down in the last couple of years steadily. It's not significant in terms of dollars when we consider the large budget. The jail's $100 million, but they have brought their overtime down considerably. The problem in the jail is that we have overtime that's mandated by a bargaining contract. So about half of the overtime worked is you will not get rid of it unless you change the bargaining agreement. And we just signed with the COs for another 2 or 3 years, so that won't change for a while. They're guaranteed a certain amount of overtime every pay period. The other half is this variable overtime. So that's when people go on vacation, somebody calls in sick, we have a high ADP, we have a lot of gang affiliated inmates that we have to staff up for them, because that happens too. That's where we have the variable overtime. That number has gone down, but it's come from maybe 3 million to 2.5 million, which is remarkable. I mean, I want to give the jail director credit for that, but in the scheme of the budget, it's not going to close the gap. It's not $27 million, but the jail is much harder to reduce the overtime because it's contracted.
Okay, all right. And Mr. Chairman, I'll probably just add this. I wanted to echo our council president in terms of the importance of HHS and the challenges we all have. These certainly aren't easy decisions. I'm not making any recommendations now or anything, but I'll just kind of give us some historical perspective for some of our new colleagues. When we first came in office, we created those reserves, 25% for the general fund and 10% on HHS. And I remember I voted for it, but I kind of held my nose on the 10% reserve on HHS. And I'll just say philosophically, when I look at those reserves, there are many of these 88 counties, many counties don't even have an HHS fund. Where does it come from? The
General fund.
general fund. So we have a separate fund, the HHS fund, and we put a reserve on it. But we have a general fund that has an exceeding beyond 20%, 25% on general fund. And like I said, I held my nose when our colleague, I guess it was Dave Greenspan, wasn't it?
It was.
Councilman Greenspan, who created the reserves on the HHS and the general fund. But in the years since that happened, I thought about it, and I'll just say from my own experience, you know, as a deacon in my church, we do the exact same thing. We have a benevolent fund. And we have a general fund that takes care of all of the bills, the church, the salaries and the debts, and keeps the church in good standing. But that benevolent fund does what we do here at the county, helps people who can't pay the gas bill or the rent or a little something on a hospital bill, and it doesn't break the church. But sometimes that benevolent fund runs out. And what happens is the church doesn't collapse. We either take some money from the strength of the general fund, or we just have to wait and say, we'll help you next week after we have passed the tray, so to speak. So I say that to say that's, at least for me, that's the perspective I look back, and I always have some concern about a reserve on the HHS levy fund, especially when we have such dire need. And I keep in mind when that levy comes up, when it comes next time to deal with the future issues, when we, in a quote unquote, pass the tray again. So I just say that again, that's what's in the back of my mind as I'm starting to make some of the decisions, or at least my 2 cents into the overall process.
I think it's going to be I assume now we're going to have this debate about the reserves as part of the budget process or soon after, and it's a healthy one to have. I will just say on the reserves is we can't run out. So it's, right. And I don't know that if I pass the tray, someone's going to put enough money in there. We have 300 more kids in custody Now, now we're at 1,900. We had 1,600 this time last year. And at one time, we were down in the 1,300s. So we can't run out because we can't not take those children if we have to. We can't not give support to their grandparents and aunts and uncles or whoever's looking after them. But I do think that there's obviously valid arguments for looking at the reserves, because you don't want to be denying services today if people need the services today.
Just a couple of comments. You're proposing tighter budgeting by not budgeting money that usually doesn't get spent, and I think overall that's a good thing. But also, what happens is that there's always stuff that comes out of left field that wasn't anticipated, and usually we cover the out of left field stuff with the over budgeting, and if there's not any over budgeting, I think it's going to be more difficult to deal with the surprises that always show up. I would second what the council president said about the opiate crisis, and noted that the Health and Human Services Plan calls for a comprehensive strategy on the opiate crisis. And I know that between now and the end of the year, the various HHS divisions are fleshing out the operational details consistent with the HHS plan. So I'm going to be interested to see what they come up with and what it's going to cost, because clearly a whole lot of really good and really dedicated people have done a whole lot of very good work on this crisis, but it keeps going in the wrong direction. So something more than what we've done so far is clearly needed. So roadmap coming up later on this week. The council president has set up a process where once the actual resolution comes out, we're going to work with each of the council members individually to provide a detailed briefing and discussion on the budget items. And next Monday, at the usual finance and budget time, we're going to have a committee of the whole meeting, and at this point, the Director Keenan is going to go through a number of the smaller departments that are pretty routine that we don't think we need to bring in the leaders of those departments for a full hearing. And then on Thursday the 19th, we have the only day on the schedule where we have budget hearings basically all day long, starting at 10 o'clock and going till about 5 o'clock. And that's when we're actually going to start into the departmental hearings. I'm going to work with our council staff to provide lunch. For it's been a tradition around here on days like that, and so we'll provide lunch for the council members so that we don't have to take 2 hours and people all split into the hinterlands, and it'll be nice. So that's next week, and we're on our way. And so with that, thank you for the opening presentation, and I'll ask my colleagues if anyone has any miscellaneous business. Has anybody signed in for public comment?
No,
Before we
Mr. Chair.
close? Okay. There being no further business before the committee of the whole, we stand adjourned. Thank you very much. Council meetings at 5 o'clock.